with Marinwood and San Rafael, as well as earthquake, flood, COVID, you name it. I kind of cover it all. So we're excited to talk to you tonight. And Kate, you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Quinn. My name is Kate Anderson. I'm a vegetation management specialist with City of San Rafael Fire Department. Pretty new to the department, started in November, but I have a background in forestry. I have a bachelor's in forestry and wildland fire science, as well as just being licensed as a California registered professional forester. I also have a few years of wildland firefighting experience and consulting forestry as well.
Excellent. Thank you. And then before we get into the presentation, a little bit of housekeeping. We're going to ask for all public comment to be held until after the presentation, at which point there will be time for public comments and questions. A brief explanation as we lead into this, and then I'm going to turn it over to Quinn and to Kate. The presentation and all the plans that you're about to see are the result of a lot of work, a lot of meetings between our agencies that involved both Quinn, Kate, other members of their staff, Fire Chief Darren White, myself, Luke Fretwell, our Recreation Director. These included on-site meetings as well as on-site assessments and inspections to many of the areas that we're going to be talking about this evening. Going into this, there were not only fire prevention considerations, but also park and rec representations, understanding that our open space is also a popular recreation area as well. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and ask Quinn to take over and walk us through this, please.
Thanks, Eric. And just while I load this presentation, I just want to offer Chief White, who's joining us this evening as well, if he wanted to make any opening comments, and I'll get this presentation loaded up. So Chief, you're my stall tactic too. Sorry to put you on the spot.
I'm more than happy to buy you a moment or two. Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you, Eric, for the great introduction and the words of appreciation for our organization, and mutually, we certainly appreciate our relationship with Marinwood and the opportunity to help expand and utilize some of the resources we have available to us, like our expertise, such as Quinn and Kate. I mean, this is huge, it's phenomenal. I'm really proud to have them part of the organization, and I'm really happy that we're able to share resources and skills and expertise such as theirs between our agencies. And so with that, it looks like Quinn may be done. I'm going to go ahead and just say thank you all for being here, and I hope that you find this presentation to be very informative. Thank you.
Thanks, Chief. So I'm going to be getting forced into some system preferences here. Yes, you can do what I'm telling you to do, Zoom. Uh-oh. Eric, it doesn't like the recording option. My high-tech security is all sorts of stuff. So
would you like me to do it for you?
Yeah, if you can do the screen share, it's basically telling me that it's going to make me quit to restart so that you can record the presentation, which I don't want to do. And so while Eric's loading that up, I'll just cover, oh, you're much more efficient. You would think by now we'd have the Zoom proficiency sorted. Thanks, Eric. So we can move on to the next couple of slides pretty quickly. We just wanted to talk to you a little bit about what we've been working on and kind of what to expect, and also provide a little bit of just an overview to make sure everybody's on the same page. If you guys have any questions following the presentation, there's all of our contact information. Eric also has it. Happy to address any questions that might come up. Go to the next one. So just briefly, and then Eric, if you want to add anything, kind of what we've gone into, and as Eric mentioned, is lots of meetings between the agencies, as well as across all the marine wildfire prevention agencies. We are basing these decisions based on risk assessments, much of which is available in the Community Wildfire Protection Plan, or the CWPP, that exists for the county. And then we look at environmental review, community and stakeholder outreach, and then kind of dive into implementation. And that's obviously a super summary of how this works, but hopefully it kind of lets you know what our priorities are as we move through this. You can go to the next one. So really quickly, and my apologies for those of you that are more familiar with the MWPA maybe than others, but I just want to make sure everybody's kind of on the same page. And so there's two big things I want everybody to kind of know about the MWPA, or the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority. And this is the joint powers agreement that is funded through Measure C, the parcel tax. So of all the tax revenue collected, which is estimated to be just under 20 million annually, 20% of it is allocated for local kind of discretionary use. And so far, that's the money we've really been working with for some of the projects you might have seen happening in Marinwood, and Kate will touch on some of those. And then we have 20% allocated towards defensible space. And this is really focused on the assessment program and that one-on-one education opportunity. So last season, we had some inspectors out in Marinwood going through and doing those. And we'll continue that partnership moving forward. And then 60% of the allocation is based on what's called core. And there's 4 things that really fall under core: vegetation management, evacuation, public education, and grants. And I'll dive in a little bit more into some of those projects. But the big thing to understand here is on the local and the defensible space, we get to do the work and then the checks come in to kind of reimburse. On the core process, we actually have to go through a much more intensive approval process and a different procurement process through the MWPA. So while the bulk of the money is in the core, it's not quite as easy for us to access. So the other piece I just want to make sure everybody understands is that hierarchy you see below. And so the board of directors, which is elected officials from all 17 member agencies, Marinwood is represented there, of course. And then the ops committee, which also represented 17 agencies. And then below that is the advisory technical committee and kind of the real nitpicky stuff. And so that's where I represent San Rafael and Marinwood, but I really rely on my team, including Kate, to come up with those projects and that guidance that we push up kind of that chain. And then of course you see that magnifying glass with the citizens oversight, which also kind of incorporates, the ESP kind of gets incorporated into that, as well as of course the advisory group. Next slide. Thanks, Eric. So this is the zone map of the MWPA, or part of it, obviously, and the part that, of course, this group cares the most about. But I share this to say for that 60% core funding, it's allocated by zone. So there's 5 zones in the MWPA. And you can see here how the San Rafael, Marinwood, Santa Venetia, and this actually, of course, goes all the way down into southern San Rafael, is all one zone. And so Kate will talk about some projects we're looking at, but we have some really unique opportunities to work across areas that benefit Marinwood without actually being Marinwood specific land, because of the way these zones are functioning in the zones for the MWPA. Next slide, Eric. So really quickly, I want to touch on defensible space. And we really look at these as kind of those one-on-one educational opportunities. So we have 5 full-time staff, and we're going to be hiring a team of seasonal, kind of recognizing the nature of when we need to be talking to residents and looking over their properties. And so through these assessments, we provide recommendations and the resources available. And those include the chipper program, and that's funded actually through the core program here moving forward. So residents will have access to multiple chipper days over the coming months. And then we are using Marinwood specific and Marinwood branded information. And of course, Marinwood codes are a little different than San Rafael. So I just want to make sure everyone's aware that we're recognizing those differences, and that's incorporated in our defensible space program. So Kate's going to kind of take it from here and dive more into some of the specific projects we're looking at for core and local and our process there. So I'll turn it over to Kate. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Gwen.
Thank you, Quinn. So I want to start getting into our specific projects, addressing environmental practices right up front. As we know, Marin, the amount of open space we have compared to our residential development is really vast. It's really abundant. And one of the core values of Marin, so I think we can all agree, is environmentalism and really conserving that land. So I wanted to dive in first to environmental due diligence. With all the projects that we have, we're obligated by law to comply with any environmental laws that have jurisdiction on the land that we want to perform work on. Starting with number 1 is the California Environmental Quality Act, maintaining, also known as CEQA. So maintaining CEQA compliance is part of every project that we perform and develop. And that can be done through a couple different pathways to comply with that law. The number one is categorical exemptions, and this really applies to the projects that we're going to be focusing on initially in that defensible space zone, or that 100-foot buffer between residential developments and the open space. Another avenue that we have to explore is the Cal VTP. That is a CEQA compliance vehicle. It's a program EIR that the state has developed for areas that are under the state responsibility area or responsibility. So Marinwood happens to be part of that. So that's another CEQA pathway that we can utilize to really streamline these processes and comply with any environmental rules while getting the work done in the timeline that we set out for ourselves. In addition to the basic requirements of complying with CEQA, we can kind of validate our reasoning to use these with a rapid biological resource assessment. That's where we go out to the site, we assess for any rare, endangered animals or plants that might be on the project area, and we can mitigate for those if they happen to be in the area, so that we don't negatively impact them with our work. After doing all of those, before we actually go out and do the work, we'll lay out the plan, specify the areas that we want the contractors to work in, and identify any areas that we need to avoid. So moving into kind of the priorities of the MWPA, environmental best practices are also a big part of what they are working on as well. They've developed an ESP working group that consists of 3 different committees. So we've been working with them to develop environmental best practices, and we're really trying to implement what they have specified for us. In addition to that, the MWPA is also working on hiring their own consulting groups to help out when we really start digging into these core projects. For the local, we're kind of on our own and maintaining compliance, but working into core, hopefully we'll have a little bit extra help with that. Next slide, please, Art. Okay, so environmental or management principles and practices. This is kind of our ethic behind what we're doing. In Marinwood, we know that there's a lot of residential development surrounded on all sides by open space. So property protection is one of our #1 priorities. We're really working in the residential areas that abut right up to Marinwood-owned open space. We also want to do this in an environmentally sound way, which really, from our perspective, is going in with a light touch, making sure that we are putting in fuel breaks that act as a buffer in between our open space and residential developments to, in the event of a wildfire, slow rate of spread, reduce intensity and severity of the fire. And we're really emphasizing that we're not doing a complete removal of fuel. This is just working to increase that vertical and horizontal continuity and go in to maintain the ecological processes of the area in a sound way. The treatment methods that we'll primarily be using, and you might have already been seeing it in the last couple of years, are prescribed grazing. We've done this with goats, many areas that have lighter fuels, mostly annual grasses. Then we'll move into, in more wooded areas, manual understory thinning. Manual means using hand tools and chainsaws, but limiting the use of mechanical equipment. And then following up with every type of fuel reduction project that we have, we want to do some sort of debris or slash disposal. In a lot of cases, this can be chipping and hopefully hauling off site. We can also chip and broadcast where hauling is not an option, trying to maintain that 3 inches or less of ground cover caused by the chips. In some areas, we can't get a chipper in, we can't remove the slash directly from the site. So we'll have a technique called lop and scatter, where we try to maintain a specific fuel bed height under typically 18 inches. That's what we're shooting. And eventually it will just bed down and break down, hopefully with some more rain. Next slide, please, Eric. All right, so this is a map I'm sure you're all with, but I wanted to highlight it just to demonstrate what I was mentioning earlier, that Marinwood is pretty much surrounded on all sides by open space. A lot of it is privately held. We can see the uncolored polygons or lack of polygons are all privately held lands, especially up in the northern part of Marinwood. Working back around, we can see that Marinwood owns a vast majority of the open space in your area. That's highlighted in green. And then County Open Space District also owns a lot of land in a large swath of that orange. So I wanted to highlight just how much open space is surrounding the community, and where we're really gonna emphasize our efforts is in that immediate intersection of the open space to residential development. Next slide, please. All right, so now we're getting into the specifics of the local projects that we'd like to accomplish in 2021. We're gonna be working on the Idleberry Fire Road fuel break from the Marin County facilities all the way to Queenstone Drive. We're going to be working on Grasshopper Hill fuel break off of Limestone Grave, and then a defensible space fuel break surrounding Elvia Court. Slide, please. So starting with Idleberry Fire Road fuel break. This area is mostly a mixed oak woodland with annual grassland right at the base of Big Rock Ridge. It's previously grazed in 2021. And there was also some light thinning work as well performed by our AmeriCorps crew that we had contracted. The plans for 2021, we're going to graze that area again, just because with every grass crop that comes in, you're going to want to really do a wide swath from end to end. And we're just going to touch up the areas that AmeriCorps got started with their manual thinning and see if we can raise that canopy up a little bit more and create more horizontal continuity between the fuel. We targeted this area just because it is, first off, with the fuel, with the fire road in a very strategic location. In a lot of places, it is right within that 100-foot zone, and a fire road is already a built-in fuel break from itself. So we're really going to be focusing on kind of filling in that area between the fire road and the residential development. And this might be an area where annual grazing can occur, and over the next couple of years, doing intermittent thinning as well, just to maintain that fuel break. Next slide, please. Okay, so Grasshopper Hill, this is off of Limestone Grade. As many of you know, this is sandwiched right in between Highway 101 and the residential area. This makes it a prime source of ignition potential. So the main goal here is using that grazing again to do a 100-foot swath all the way around. There's a couple areas with more dense understory right under those oaks. So we're going to go in and try to thin out that. And like I said before, try to raise that canopy and increase the horizontal discontinuity of that fuel. Next slide, please. Then Elvia Court. This is a little bit different of a fuel community. We have more of a oak bay forest with mixed oak woodland that kind of comes into an annual grassland as well. So this area is it's very thick, it's overgrown, highly dense, and can't see it in this map, but it is also the open space goes right over to 101, and that's a large swath that we'd like to put in a buffer using exclusively manual thinning in this case. It's not a good site for goats, but we can get hand crews up there and do that manual thinning that I was talking about to take down most of the understory. There's a lot of broom in there, so taking down those invasive plants, thinning out any small diameter trees to increase the spacing between boles. And I think we can do a lot of pruning work in there to raise the canopy height. Debris disposal is going to be a little bit trickier in this one. There's not a whole lot of access to get any kind of mechanized equipment like a chipper up in that area. So we're going to have to do probably more of a lop and scatter approach to debris disposal and really try to get that material to bed down to start out with. Next slide, please. So the 3 areas I just talked about are where, after doing a risk assessment based on ignition probability, proximity to homes, we also wanted to make sure to take a look at other open space areas within Marinwood. These areas are also of priority because they are open space. They are also in proximity to homes. But looking at the Lucas Valley Estates in the Creekside area and Ellen Drive individually, they're more of islands. They're not continuous open space that starts at the residential area and goes into kind of a wider swath. So while they are still a priority, we are putting them more on the lower down on the list. And if there is leftover funding, or if we see a need in the next couple of years, we'll start making access into those areas to do preliminary fuel reduction work. Also to address an area that was managed last year by the AmeriCorps crew is the Queenstone Fire Road to Valleystone Drive. Our AmeriCorps crews came in and did some light understory thinning work that under our assessment this year is pretty adequate. And I think we'll be readdressing that in the next couple of years. Also with this area, we can see on the Valleystone Drive and Blackstone Drive that it's more of a north facing slope. So the understory is already really open and can manage itself for a little bit longer. Next slide, please.
Kate, before you move on, can you
Yeah.
also address the work that was done in the Creekside area just this past couple months ago?
Yeah, thanks for reminding me about that, Eric. Yeah, our AmeriCorps crews were really crucial to the work that we got done in Marinwood and in San Rafael last year. And they also put in a really good fuel break along the Creekside Trail. So kind of a buffer in between those residential areas in Lucas Valley Road to maintain that defensible space in that area. Because it is a riparian area, there, it's more moist, it's more shaded. That's an area of lower priority to readdress in this next year.
Okay, and then before we move on, I think Commissioner Fine has a quick question. Ian?
Yes.
Are we allowed to ask questions as we go, or should we save them for the end?
Kate, preference?
We can take questions now while we're on the topic.
I was curious about where the AmeriCorps crew did their work between Queenstone and Valleystone.
Yeah, I can clarify that for you. The AmeriCorps crew followed Queenstone Fire Road up until it got out of that 100-foot zone. So there's a small swath off of the fire road in between that defensible space. And then they picked up their work. I'm trying to, along the Valley Stone Drive, kind of where you can see this denser vegetation of that bay. They kept following along that area until it departed from that Marinwood open space boundary around that sharp left bend in Queenstone Fire Road, right where Eric's cursor is.
That's great. And then you mentioned the north facing slope, which does seem very shaded and not, like, just with my untrained eye, not a huge fire risk. Which side slopes are the most dangerous? Is it, I feel like I hear about the Diablo winds in the East Bay coming from east to west. Is that the biggest threat, or is how do you assess the different slopes and how dangerous they are?
Yeah, so that brings up a good point. On the ground, without the influence of wind or other atmospheric conditions, north-facing slopes are going to be more moist, they're more shaded. I mean, they get less sun. So they're typically going to be more vegetated than southwest-facing slopes, which are hotter, they're drier, and a more apparent fire risk from a fuel perspective. You're correct that, you know, we have winds that come out of the northwest. So that's where northwest slopes are more susceptible to wind-driven fire impacts. But from a vegetative community perspective, north-facing slopes are typically less susceptible if you're having a fuel-driven fire.
Kate, if I can jump in, and I think that's a great answer, and I just even add a little bit more just so everybody's on the same page in terms of fire behavior. So fire spreads in different ways. There's wind-driven fires, right? There's fuel that can be, so if nothing is there to burn, the fire has nowhere to go, even if the wind's potentially pushing it. But then we also see fires spread via embers. In that case, the wind can push embers potentially up to 1 mile plus in front of that main fire, and those embers start additional fires. And so the other thing we look at and why the sun exposure matters so much is because of how much it dries the fuel. So the drier fuels are, the more prone they are, and the quicker they'll burn and the hotter they'll burn. So that's just something we consider, as well as things like humidity and other things. So there's a lot of fire science, and we don't want to bore you, but just kind of thinking about moisture levels in addition to those wind directions is ultimately part of that risk assessment. I see one more question.
I do. Eric, will you go back a slide, please? Oh, yeah. On this one, so on Grasshopper Hill, you were doing a whole circle around the hill. Is there a reason why we're only limited to it on this block and not going down towards Ellen or Lucas Valley Road?
I can handle that. Kathleen, this area, if you can see where my cursor is privately owned land. The district does not own this land. It is owned by a developer who is planning on putting in housing in this area.
Okay, and so is it not worth it doing a fire line between our property and their property?
Well, their property goes right here. So you can kind of see where it is. So this goes right up, and then their property is here. And then Marinwood CSD owned property begins right here and then goes this way around like this here. So right now, and until that is developed, what we're looking at is these homes that are existing in the time being, and we're not able or allowed to move into private property to do these.
Yeah,
Okay.
and Eric, I think that's all accurate. And the one thing I would add too is just this focus on kind of a house out mentality. And while certainly creating shaded fuel breaks kind of in more of like the middle of open space has a benefit, we're trying to use the fire roads for that as much as possible. And that when we're doing these types of projects, it's really focused around creating that 100-foot defensible space for the individual properties. But to some extent too, our inspection programs and our assessments potentially have some impacts on some of those private landholders, but again, with a real focus on distance to structure.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Eric. So this slide, I really wanted to highlight really zooming back. The last 3 projects will be locally funded, but really zooming out and utilizing the structure that the MWPA has put in for core projects is where we can really look big picture and try to put treatments on the ground that can cross jurisdictional boundaries and across the jurisdictional boundaries and really make sense on the ground without having to worry about stopping at the property lines and putting in fuel reduction projects that essentially seem incomplete. So what we're eyeing for this area is really trying to continue the fuel break that we're starting on Idleberry Fire Road and moving west through the county land, through CSA 13, to the end of the residential development in Marinwood, and really creating that entire Marinwood defensible space fuel zone. This map also highlights another project that we're developing in inventorying and assessing fire roads within our San Rafael zone, starting with our open space and then moving out throughout the entire zone. And we'd like to include the Marinwood fire roads in that effort. With the inventory and assessment, we're looking at vegetation clearance, both vertically and horizontally, as well in addressing any long-term surface or drainage improvements that might need to be made to ensure an effective response onto those roads. So next slide, please, Eric. So I'm going to hand it back off to Quinn now to take it away.
Kate, apologies. May I ask you, I have a quick question on the previous slide.
Yeah, of course.
Sorry, Pascal.
Thank you. So there's a rectangular area at the north to the upper right. I'm assuming this is some kind of privately owned area. It seems to surround that development at the very end of Blackstone.
Mm-hmm. Correct. Yeah, that is privately owned open space. Eric has probably a better handle on the ownership there.
This area that you're referring to, Pascal, up in here is owned by multiple different groups. So a large chunk of it is owned by the Regency Homeowners Association. Another chunk is owned by the Carmelite Monastery. Another piece, as you get over into here, is owned by Marin Municipal Water District, as well as other small parcels that are also owned by the Regency Homeowners Association.
And
And
I think
then- Go ahead, Quinn, I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to add, I think the real benefit of core funding is being able to establish projects that aren't necessarily dependent on landowners. And so just because it's kind of not in the color coding doesn't mean it's not necessarily a potential treatment area as we really look towards these big core projects that can engage multiple landowners through that process.
Yeah, just expanding on that, this is a really good opportunity for collaboration. We talked about right at the beginning of this presentation and really working with our partners from other agencies to put treatments on the ground that make sense.
Eric, sorry, people who live there, and there's only maybe a dozen houses there plus the convent. Are they in Marinwood CSD territory, or they're completely their own thing?
No, they are in our jurisdiction, but the open space surrounding their homes is not owned by Marinwood. We do not own that open space portion.
Got it. So they basically have just really large backyards that are forests.
No, it's designated open space that was created when the developments were built, the monastery as well. But they're designated open space. They go beyond individual property owner residential properties, but they are not owned by Marinwood CSD. They are privately held lands.
Interesting. So okay. So the bottom line is, they're defended by the Marinwood Fire Department, but we just can't go on their land and fix it because they somehow control it through their HOA.
There's access issues. There's also gift of public fund issues. And that's why Kate was referring to some of the core projects that are looking at countywide that I'm sure would be much more amenable to being able to set up a larger agreement.
Okay, I'm just thinking from a perspective, and look, they're their own thing, that's their choice, right? I guess I'm thinking from a perspective of the, I guess, folks who have regular houses, but who are now not protected by all these fire breaks because it just so happened that the guy up next door, controls the land and the forest and doesn't do anything about it.
So I would say as part of that defensible space program, right, every property can be inspected and at a minimum is required to maintain 100 feet of defensible space from any structure. So it's not just the structure they own. So if their property is within 100 feet of another structure, we can kind of build out from around that, if that makes sense, and potentially issue, ideally it's education and that's enough to motivate them. And we can offer resources like chipper days. But if it is a big enough hazard, there's other opportunities there.
Thank you. Appreciate the insights. It just feels like obviously a big hole, but the work that was done around the southern part of that, around Blackstone Lane, I'm sorry, Valley Stone Drive, obviously that's fantastic as it's heavily wooded. Thank you all.
Can you say just one more word about the fire road inventory and assessment, about what specifically it is? Are you just, like in terms of the inventory, it feels like we have a sense of what the fire roads are now. Or is it?
So really the hope is we're going to drive them, and we have a new app built where we can basically pin issues. So whether that's overhanging vegetation on the fire roads, vegetation coming up to the side of the fire roads, or major erosion issues, because if you can't drive an engine up it, it's not a super useful fire road. And so that initial inventory is gathering all those potential trouble spots. And then we're going to use that information to move forward with projects to correct those issues.
And then Ian, just to also be clear, even though we've labeled it as Idleberry Fire Road, that is not an active fire road. It hasn't been for some time. That was an active fire road back before the district acquired those lands. That's kind of more known as Idleberry Trail. But it is not passable or operable as a fire road at this point in time.
So Eric, I think if you can go to the next slide.
Yep.
And I think this will be pretty close to wrapping up, and then we can take additional questions. But just want to make everybody aware that in addition to the vegetation kind of management projects Kate touched on, and obviously that's a huge piece of wildfire prevention, there's also a lot of other projects going on that are going to impact and benefit Marinwood. So evacuation planning, and I want to be very clear with that, like there is evacuation plans for the entire county. There have been for a while, but they're very tactical. And so this evacuation effort is really trying to make it something that's accessible to residents and is much less tactical and for first responders. And there's two different programs associated with that. And I apologize, that should be Zone Haven with a V, not a Z. And then Fire Safe Marin, obviously a great organization across the county, does a ton of educational programming. They are receiving Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority funds at this point to continue and expand. And so we'll actually be doing a zone specific webinar coming up here in the next couple months that'll address San Rafael and Marinwood specific items and a lot of other great material coming out. And then they're going to manage the chipper program. They've got great software, great, really streamlined process. And so we're hoping in the San Rafael zone, and that includes Marinwood, Lucas Valley, Santa Venetia, right, the CSAs. We're hoping to see something like, I think it'll probably be close to 80 to 100 chipper days in the coming year. So really excited about that opportunity to provide to residents to support them in their defensible space and defensible space efforts. So those are just a few. There are more, but we don't want to keep you all night. And so I think with that, just quickly on the what's next and what to expect. And so we'll see the formal work plan for the coming fiscal year here in the next month or so. We're going to continue to seek ongoing feedback. Obviously, Kate, myself, the rest of our team will continue to work closely with Eric and his team. We're going to hopefully start seasonal inspections in the May timeline. So you'll see us out knocking on doors. And then, of course, chipper days and the implementation of these vegetation projects Kate mentioned, of course, following environmental review and contracting and all that good stuff. And I believe our next slide is questions. So we're ready whenever you are, Eric, to open that up.
Great. Thank you again very much. Appreciate Kate and Quinn and your team and all the time you guys put into that presentation. Before we go to public questions, are there any questions from commissioners and or board liaisons? I see John Campo, you have a hand up.
Yeah, I have a whole series of questions. As you might imagine, I'll just start by saying it looks great. This represents a big shift in how we manage open space. Obviously, it's a big influx in cash and doing some of this important defensible space work. And I will say I'm happy to see that the work is focused on the perimeter, on the defensible space, and not in the interior. That seems to be a much bigger bang for our buck and less of open space impacts if that work was further in the interior. You know, I very much value the public safety work that's being proposed here. And I should add, I also very much care for the open space. Eric mentioned some of the goals, such as public safety, recreation, and park consideration. I didn't hear any mention at all about biological considerations, about sensitive species, about invasive species management. And so I'd like to hear a little more about that and how this work, how you think about invasive species management, sensitive species, as this work proceeds.
Yeah, Kate, if I can start that, and then maybe you can add on, and depending on kind of and some of this is really detailed. So if you want a really detailed answer, we're happy to talk offline. I don't necessarily want to, but I think the environmental.
I mostly want to know that there's thought going into the process about the biology. I represent the Park Commission.
Sure.
So again, I'm happy to see this work. It's very important, but I would be negligent if I didn't voice up my concerns for the open space. So I just want to make sure that in your process, you are considering the biological impacts.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's one of the reasons we were so excited to get Kate on board as a registered forester, not just someone that looks from the wildfire side of things, but someone that really looks at forest health and forest management and what that means overall. And she's the first one to say, right, that a healthy forest is the best, one of our best defenses against wildfire. So that is definitely a big piece. We've also really intentionally expanded the rest of our team from an environmental standpoint. With a certified arborist on the team, as well as someone else that holds an environmental degree. So we're really trying to blend fire in the environment. And part of that environmental review process, and I think Kate mentioned on that environmental slide, that after we go through that initial CEQA compliance, and that's the bare minimum requirement, we are taking it a step further to do biological site assessments to look for those special species. And part of the planning that we provide to contractors will actually scope out any areas that are don't touch, nesting type of things, and things like that. So that's something we currently do and continue to expand. And I hope that addresses your concern, but Kate, if you have anything.
Yeah, I didn't hear much about invasive species management. And in regards to sensitive species, I saw one of the slides said there was a rapid bioassessment conducted. I don't know what that means. So without doing a kind of a floristic survey, I'm not sure how you would know if there is a sensitive species there or not. And I'm not talking about necessarily forest species, I'm talking about grassland species.
Sure, Kate, do you want to address that?
Yeah, so John, we've contracted out these rapid biological assessments. What our contractor or consultant will do, they'll run reports through the CNDDB, the California database that CDFW maintains to kind of pinpoint whether there's been any observations of special status rare or endangered species on the land. Then they'll come out and follow up with an on-site review as well. They'll do the botany survey, they'll do the wildlife survey based on the results of their database runs that they've done. After that, they'll compile it and report to us, and we'll come out and make sure that the project is laid out appropriately, that those areas are protected, or we'll readjust our treatment methods as needed, if anything, or if any species do pop up on the sites.
And I'd add specifically around the invasive piece, I think a big part of that is the debris removal plan. And so that's why Kate mentioned we prefer not to chip and scatter, because there's obviously seeding issues and potential invasive species spread there. And that one of our big fuel reduction techniques is broom removal, and getting rid of that invasive there. And I'm sure there's some other considerations as well, but it is definitely on the radar and definitely an important part of what we're doing.
Yeah, and French and Scotch broom are the main species that we're targeting to reduce ladder fuels, especially in these more forested areas. So that's big from a environmental standpoint, removing the invasive species and mitigating the fuel reduction or the fuel hazard risk in one go.
So I have some follow-up questions. So in regards to the sensitive species, you said the CND database, if there is information or data that identifies a sensitive species in a particular area, then your biologist would follow up. Oftentimes these areas have never been surveyed, so there likely would be no data. So the absence of data doesn't really tell us if anything's there. So I'm wondering if there would be additional surveys done prior to the work during the flowering season, so we would actually know if there's something there, because it feels like the absence of data doesn't really tell us much. And then just going back to the invasive species, you know, that's a, I think I don't have to really mention this, but it's a multi-million, if not billion-dollar problem in California. And not far from here, we have barbed goat grass, which is an agriculture invasive species, which wreaks havoc in the agriculture industry. So you didn't mention anything about tools being cleaned prior to coming on site to ensure that we don't bring an invasive species to our open space, which we don't already have.
Yeah. John, you touched on a really good point. As far as cleaning the tools, you know, we're already implementing that because of sudden oak death concerns. So that's something that we already do. That it's really important to make sure that everything is taken off before we move sites, including ourselves. So that is part of our process to make sure that we and our equipment are clean when exiting the site and before we start work on another site. Can you refresh me on your first question?
I'm just wondering, and you know, you might just not have an answer for it, is really getting at the, do we know the site well enough before we start taking action in regards to maybe a rare plant or sensitive species that we just don't know about? If there was a pre-construction or pre-work survey, that would need to be timed with the flowering season so it would be identifiable. I don't feel like the CDNBB database is going to provide you that information, just because there's more often than not just the absence of data.
Yeah,
Mr. Campbell, this is Chief White. I appreciate the series of questions you have. They're very well, you know, thought out, obviously, and you have some substantial background in this area, it sounds like. And so for the sake of tonight's presentation, I think we were generally just giving an overview. We weren't going into the level of detail that you're seeking right now, but I would certainly offer that we can take these questions offline, and any number of questions you have, if you wouldn't mind putting them into a document, we have, you know, no problem providing the responses. And to your concerns about additional species that may not be in the California database, I would offer, if you have any additional information that could be helpful to us, or anyone you know has information that may be helpful to us as we go out and conduct our own assessments. We certainly encourage that you share that information with us, because what we would hate to do is find ourselves inadvertently affecting a species that we weren't aware of, that, as you stated, was not in the database. But it sounds like maybe there's some potential information or knowledge that you're aware of. And if you not personally aware of, but maybe have some other sources, we'd love to interact with those personnel as well, so we don't make a mistake and have to double back on our efforts somehow.
Yeah, thanks for that. I would like to continue this offline because I do have a lot of detailed questions. I do not have any special data set for some of these areas, but I'm concerned about them just because I work for Marin County Open Space and I manage 16,000 acres. And oftentimes we go into a new site to work on a trail project or something, and we do a biological assessment prior to that work, and we find things that we didn't know were there. So I'm just wondering, what is the process for that? I don't want to come across as super critical, because I think these are good projects and I really value that you're focusing on the perimeter, but I just want to be a voice for the biological considerations. And I think maybe one just final question before I sign off is, once you start these sites, what would be the management interval or frequency of return? Like, will they be managed in perpetuity after that?
Yeah, I can take that. I think that's a great question. And the tax measure currently is 10 years. At the end of 10 years, it'll be up for renewal. So I think, like many things, it'll be funding dependent. But the plan is, and what Kate and some of our other colleagues have been working really hard on is initial risk reduction and then long-term management. And part of that long-term management is how many years, every couple of years, we need to go back and clean up limbs or understory thinning, to regrowth and maintain. So we are definitely looking at maintenance. After that 10-year mark, it'll be a funding question. It might not get to be as frequent as we want. But that is the hope, as well as, long term. And I'm not the environmental expert. Certainly Kate and Gavin are in that sense, but looking at how we can use some of these opportunities to improve recreation or reintroduce more native fire tolerant plants back into the landscape that should be there, that might have been kind of put out by some of these more invasive species. So I think there's a lot of potential, and we do look at these sites beyond the initial risk reduction.
Thank you.
Thanks for the thoughtful questions.
Kathleen, you had a hand up. Is that from earlier? Okay, are there any other questions from commissioners or liaisons? Ian.
I have a question about the chipper days. I'm actually like Googling it now and learning more about it, which I had not heard of before, and would love to hear more about. And I'm reading about last year's season, so I'd be curious, like how much was it used? Did you hit your capacity, or do you feel like it's a thing that's being offered that people don't know, like me, don't know about and don't use?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I apologize for thinking everybody knew what a chipper day was. So let me back up. And a chipper day is an opportunity for literally a chipper attached to a truck to go to residential curbside, and residents can leave the debris in their public right of way. And the chipper picks it up and chips it, and as needed, takes those filled trucks to the appropriate refuge location. And so I would say overall, we saw really positive usage. Fire Safe Marin actually put together a really wonderful, like 20-page book on the chipper program over the past year. And I'm happy to share a copy with Eric, and he can share it with the rest of you if that's of interest. We did see a lot of utilization. And one of the things we're really going to try to target this year, and we saw a lot of success with last year, is timing our assessments and our inspections with the chipper program. So being able to go out and do those assessments and then say, and by the way, 3 weeks from now, the chipper's here, here's how you can sign up. And so really trying to time that well to give people that ability. And then we'll see a lot more outreach. We'll have a lot more days, so we'll be able to do some broader outreach as well. But overall, they're really, I think, utilized and supported.
Yeah, Ian, I can add for Marinwood, I know one day completely filled up and they wound up scheduling a second day where they came out and were actually able to handle some other debris that we had for us. Um, They, again, in that first year, everything kind of came together fast. We blasted it out through our various social media channels on our website, through a scrolling banner across the top of the homepage, and put out the notice. And we certainly have been communicating, as Quinn said, about trying to also advertise this availability through at the same time as the home assessment inspections happen. And then also making sure that people understand that you do need to reserve a spot. That doesn't happen directly through the CSD. It actually happens through Fire Safe Marin, who coordinates all of the chipper days across the entire county. So I at any rate, that was a little bit of how that went last year, and I expect more of it in the coming years on an annual basis, at least 2 days in this area alone.
And I'll piggyback on that. Eric, you're absolutely correct. Rich Shortall explained just recently to the Marin County Fire Chiefs Association the goal of the Fire Safe Marin to expand their chipper days substantially this year, so that each neighborhood or each area gets at least 2 opportunities for chipping. And this is going to move well into next spring as well. So there's going to be additional overlap, if you will, from a 14-day standpoint. And then moving into, I think it's next March or May, they're looking to re-engage again on chippers towards the end of the fiscal year. So this is going to be an expanded effort, certainly from what I can understand.
Are we almost done with all this?
Yeah. Want some ice cream or something?
Oh, I just want feel.
And Tom, you're kind of bleeding into the meeting.
Love some ice cream.
I went ahead and muted you for now, Tom. But yes, we would all like ice cream. Okay, any other questions? Thank you, Chief, by the way. Any other questions here? If not, I will open it up to public questions. Okay. From the public, 1 second, please. And remember, if you're listening, hit the raise hand feature, or if you're calling in by phone, you may push *9.
Eric, and while you're doing that, if I can just, is there a time limit on the public questions? And then do you want us to address them one by one, or wait until the end and address them as a whole?
Well, let's see how many questions we get. Typically, we ask people to limit public comment questions to 3 minutes. Given the nature, if we could extend that maybe to 5 and see what happens. Thank you for asking. Stephen.
Yes, good evening. I did have some comments that I had hoped to address at the beginning of the meeting, but I'll just concentrate on the questions right now. First of all, I want to thank John Campo for his questions and concerns. I'm glad that he is looking out for the biological impact of this. And I agree with him. It's basically this is a really good program, but we want to do it the right way, and we want to do it sensitive to our landscape. This is Marinwood after all, and we love our open space and we love our tree canopies. My questions are specifically about exactly what's being done and how far it's going. I did see the maps. You mentioned 100-foot space, 100-foot defensible space, but I don't actually know what that means. And when I see that you're going to clear out the under canopy in wooded areas, how far up does that go? And then lastly, who's going to be doing this work? And I assume all the material, there's going to be men and equipment going in, and there's going to be lots of debris coming out. I just would like more specifics. So let's start with the borderline, and if you could explain that, and then could you explain exactly, how much material will remain on the landscape?
Yeah, I can start with that, Eric, if that's all right.
Sure, please.
and then Kate, feel free to add. So the 100 feet from a structure, and that's largely kind of the standard defensible space. And so what that means is, you might, if you start from the street in someone's mailbox, they might have 10 feet, and then you hit the house, and then the house might be, and I am making up numbers because I don't know how big houses are anymore, but maybe the house itself is 50 feet. And then from the place where that house ends, 100 feet out. So and their property line, so their house might end on the open space side, and then their property line might only go 20 feet. So they're responsible for that 20 feet because that's their property. But we want to make sure that we're also doing the rest of that 80 feet into open space. In some cases, someone might own an entire 100 feet of defensible space behind their home. And in that case, this particular border work probably isn't going to necessarily impact them because the goal is to create that 100-foot buffer. There's some distance variance for slope just because fire moves faster uphill. So sometimes we might look a little bit of expanding that 100 feet if we're looking at steep slope. And then the question about the understory, we usually use about 6 foot height at a max to 1/3 of the tree. So if a tree is short, now depending that, if it's a bushy shrub or something, it might make sense to remove that shrub in order to protect the larger mature oak or other beautiful tree above it. And so generally we're thinking about kind of a 6 foot, kind of as clear as possible space. And that way any fire that was on the ground would stay on the ground, which is actually, generally speaking, pretty healthy for the environment, and not be able to get into the canopy, which is where we see really devastating impacts to the forest as well as to people. Kate, anything to add, or is that?
Yeah, well, there was something to say, well, we can work if there's a structure that's closer than 100 feet. I don't know. It's just, I'll have to look at the tape again, but it just didn't quite make sense. But let's set that aside for right now. And so how high up on the tree canopy are you clearing?
So the canopy itself wouldn't be cut. It's the limbs, it's the understory up
Okay.
to 6 feet, or a third of the tree's height.
Okay, only 6 feet.
Mhm.
Okay, and now this is going to be handwork. I think you mentioned that, and I assume this is going to be contracted out through a third party. Are we to understand that? And
Mhm, that's correct.
how big a cruise? I guess I'm just trying to figure out what we're going to see in our open space, like a crew of 6 guys or something. Just working that perimeter, or
Yeah, so we haven't contracted it out yet. And so part of that bid will determine that. And some of that's a speed, right? More people can get it done quicker. But there's also, in a lot of cases, you can only fit so many people safely in an area and so much equipment safely in an area. So generally, I think you're in a reasonable size team in terms of what we think of, but until we actually start getting those contracts and requests for proposals out, we won't know, but that'll all be part of the consideration. The chipper days are 3-person crews per chipper and truck, but I know that doesn't really answer your question. And again, that contracting process will vary whether it's local funding or core funding.
yeah. So I'm just really just trying to understand what's going on. So we're not going to see wood chips, big piles of wood chips in the open space. Is that correct? Or
yeah, we wouldn't leave
what is going to
piles.
happen to all the debris?
So we'll chip and haul as much as we can. And then if we're in a place where we can't haul it out and we have to do what Kate references, chip and scatter, which again has limitations from a seed bank situation in terms of spreading invasives. But we wouldn't want that chip material to be more than 3 inches deep. So there might be a pile temporarily, like for a day, but then the plan would be that would be raked out and spread. But usually we wouldn't see piles, no.
All right. Okay. And any heavy equipment that we would see back there, like a 6x6? What generally speaking, what kind of equipment are they bringing into the woods? You say it's by hand, but I assume they have a truck or some kind of vehicle, or.
Yeah, I mean, usually the chippers are on pickup trucks or behind kind of a like an open bed dump truck is too big, but I don't know what you call those chipper trucks. I don't know if Luke, maybe you know what those
Sure.
are called. But yeah, I mean, the plan would be mainly chainsaws and loppers, and nothing other than the chipper itself, from a heavy. We're not looking at bringing dozers or scraping ground or anything like that within that 100-foot.
Yeah, this is really steep landscape, so I don't think you're going to be bringing chipper trucks to most of those locations. So basically, you know, those limbs, those branches, everything has to come out.
Mhm.
So, you know, is it going to be a logging operation basically on that section of the landscape?
No, I wouldn't call it a logging operation. And it will just, as part of that's what's going to be time consuming about it. In some of these cases, it is really difficult to get equipment. So there's a lot of manual dragging. Any resident that wants to provide a right of way potentially through a backyard to a site where we could put equipment, will certainly be happy to work with them.
Okay.
But that access is all going to be part of those projects as they get sorted. And that's part of what Kate and our colleague Gavin will be responsible for as these projects get underway. And we'll work closely, of course, with Eric and Luke to actually be on site with these folks, managing it, making sure they're taking care of things the way they need to be, and ultimately leaving the landscape in better condition with some of these invasives and other things removed.
Well, I appreciate your priorities, and I also appreciate what John Campo had said. Really, we're talking about a balancing act here. We certainly want you to do the work, but we want it done in such a way that our landscape won't be scarred, and you know, we'll have a lot of you know, a lot of ugly landscape where, you know, a beautiful field was before. So I guess I'll just leave it at that. We don't know, you know, how this is going to go, but I just want you to know, as a resident, I'm concerned about making sure our open space is properly protected. Thank you.
Appreciate that feedback. Thank you. Eric?
When the only other thing I would add to that question is for the goat grazing, they do have a herder that stays on site. They typically will bring a little trailer. Last year, those were parked just inside of fire gate access points. So that way, as he's moving the herd along the area, he literally stays there 24/7 with them. So you might see something like that in that area too. And we typically alert the immediate neighbors of, hey, that's not somebody taking up residence. They belong there, and they're usually very well accepted. And in fact, I think I heard of an instance where they brought the gentleman some food one afternoon as well. So
I'm sure he appreciates that. They work hard out there making all, they got to set up all those electric fences and tear them down and keep moving them for the goats. So
right. That looks like that is it for public comment. I don't have anybody else. Is there any other questions or comments from either of the two commissions or the board liaisons who are participating? Luke, if you had anything to add, you wanted to add, by all means, please feel free.
Thanks, Eric. No, I think that was a wonderful presentation, and I really appreciate all the work that you put into that. Thank you so much for giving us the lowdown on what's being planned.
absolutely.
Great. Then before we adjourn, I certainly want to thank again Kate Anderson and Quinn Gardner and Chief Darren White. I can't stress enough how much I appreciate the relationship we have with your agency, and how much benefit I feel that we gain as a community through that relationship. At the end of the day, Marinwood is small, and joining and partnering with Santa Fe has expanded our resource reach innumerable amounts. So thank you guys again very much for your time, very much for your expertise. I certainly enjoy working with you, and I think the whole community stands to benefit from your thoughtful presence and actions and guidance. So thank you very much for your time and joining us tonight.
Happy to join you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you. Thank you, Quinn. Thank you, Kate.
Okay, with that, I think we will go ahead and adjourn this meeting at 8:21 p.m. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. The vast majority of this was recorded. I think I missed the first minute of the meeting. So I apologize, but we will be posting this so it can be viewed again. So again, thank you all. Have a wonderful night, and I will be talking to each of you
Hey.
soon, I am sure.
Chief White, can you stay on really quick? And Eric, did you get my answer?
Yeah, I'll follow up. I'll follow up with you, Kathleen.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good
No,
evening,
no,
everybody.
my response answer.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night, all.
Thank you. Good night.
Commissioner Kilkenny, you had a response answer. I don't know if I saw that.
What